I'm Isabella and you're listening to Zeno. Each month I have conversations with people from all walks of life about their personal stories of home, identity and the search for belonging. Welcome to the show, Maya Mitsuko September Welford. So happy to have you here to delve into everything around names in light of your podcast, That's My Name. How do you describe yourself and the work that you do?
Firstly, thank you for having me on. I'm really excited to be on. And it's quite nice to be on the other side, the guest side, because I've done so many episodes recently in my podcast. So it's nice to be on the other side. So thank you. How would I describe myself? I'm Maya Mitsuko September Welford. I think, in my day role, I'm a Behavioural Finance Specialist at Barclays. And outside of that, I'm a podcast host for That's My Name. I also do some coaching and public speaking.
Wonderful, amazing. Tell me a bit about what inspired you to launch That's My Name.
So during the pandemic, I think everyone was starting a podcast. There were so many podcasts popping up. Yeah. And I wanted to do the same. But actually, I didn't want to just start it for the sake of starting it. So I kind of sat on it for a bit and I tested with a few different ideas. And actually, in a short space of time, I was just randomly having conversations with people about their names. So I've got a friend, Jamie, and we were sitting in London Fields in Hackney 2 years ago. And he was randomly speaking about his name, and he's got loads of different middle names, which really reflect his background and heritage. So I was like, oh, that's quite interesting. I didn't really realise that about him. So I felt like I'd learnt something new about him. And then about a week later, I was speaking to someone else who was sharing with me naming traditions in a tribal community within Ghana. And I was like, I didn't realise that. That's really interesting. So they name children based on the day of the week that they were born. And I was like, that's fascinating. And then all of a sudden I had this light bulb moment and I was like, I could do a podcast about this. And reflecting on my own experiences with my own name, I feel like I was quite well positioned to be able to bring that element into it as well.
Wow, that's wonderful. And yeah, you had your own unique experience with it that you can kind of bring into the show. So I would love to ask you, when people ask you the question, where are you from? What answer do you give and what truths are missing from that answer?
I think it really depends on who's asking that question. But typically I'm from London and I do very much, I think, tie a lot of my identity to being a Londoner, specifically an East Londoner, the best place in the world. So I think I do tie a lot of my identity to that. I am feeling recently that I need to get out of London and just get out because I had literally been here my whole life. I guess what's missing from that is my heritage. So I'm half Japanese, half English, but you might not necessarily get that. But that's not to say that I'm from Japan, because I'm not. But I think when we ask the question, where are you from? It can be interesting. And, there are different motivations for people to ask that. But I think that there's so much more to people's identity than simply the question, where are you from?
You've touched on this pride of being a Londoner. And it's interesting because I also grew up in London and I have a very complex relationship with London. For me and for other people I've spoken to as well, it's like the answer you give when someone asks you where you're from changes over time. And I probably have said many times in my life that I'm from London. I have grown up here for a long part of my life, but I don't sit well with that answer so much now. I feel I'm interested in building a sense of British identity. What does that mean? What does that mean in a multicultural Britain that's also coming from a deep colonial imperial history? What does that look like? And from something I've noticed from people with strong London identity is there is something unique about London culture that sits separate from the rest of Britain.
Yeah, really interesting points that you raise. I think for me, when I think or hear about the term British culture, I'm really what even is that? And I think what a lot of people in different countries, they think of British culture as people are really posh and they speak like the Queen. All of those stereotypes when you think about England. For me, there's also that British culture of And for me, being from the East End, that's like worlds away from anything that people might assume when we think about having afternoon tea, all of those kind of things. For me, it's more like fish and chips and pie and mash, rather than
Johnny deals.
Exactly. So it's an interesting one when we think about like British culture in itself. And I don't think that there's one such thing as like British culture, which you can really simply define. And especially when we think about London, and I think this is why I separate it. And I am very reluctant to, and I don't really define myself as I'm English or I'm British. I like, that's never kind of something that I'm like drawn to assigning to my identity, even though I guess to some extent it is. But I think what you mentioned earlier is there is a very different culture when we think about like London culture, because it is such a mishmash of so many different cultures and communities, which I think absolutely should be celebrated. And it is something that I'm proud of.
There's a lot of nuance to Britishness, isn't there? In London, the movement of people from East London has led to this kind of, they call what the accent specialists, or if you can call them that, they call it like the multicultural London accent. And it's the mix of diasporic communities who were in East London and now are moving slowly out to Southeast London and further parts of London for obvious reasons, and how that creates this kind of mishmash of accents. And that is uniquely London, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. It is so interesting on the accents piece. And also when we think about like the assumptions that people make about people purely based on their accent is phenomenal. And I guess with like psychology background, we're just full of biases and we're constantly making judgments and assumptions about people, which isn't always true or accurate.
What would you say are your earliest memories of feeling like an outsider or feeling different?
So when I was in primary school, it was an interesting time. I mean, I really enjoyed it on the whole, but there were times that were, I think, difficult. And when I look back, as I mentioned, grew up in East London, went to primary school in Bethnal Green. So that's predominantly a Bengali community. So I was in a school which was, I'd say, 90% Bengali children, and the rest made up of Somalian, Moroccan, English. There were no other Japanese children or even half Japanese children in my year, in the year above, in the year above me, apart from my sister. She was a few years above. When I look back, it's quite interesting because it's like we were in a part of London where there's a big Bengali community. But if we think about wider society or within the workplace now, the Bengali community is very much a minority. So I think it was quite an interesting experience to be like a minority within the school, but then externally within society, I would be more within that majority because of, you know, the colour of my skin and so on. But I guess in terms of feeling like an outsider, I think there was a real lack of embracing difference. And I think when you're children, you can make remarks about, you know, for me, it was like just targeting that Japanese side, just being like, the food that Japanese people eat, or like, do you eat dogs? Like, firstly thinking that Chinese and Japanese people are the same, and then being like, you all eat dogs and horses and stuff like that. And it's like, okay. Or like sushi's weird and stuff like that. But it's really interesting now that I'm an adult, now suddenly being Japanese is really cool and eating sushi is really cool. So I guess that's a reflection of how London and perhaps the UK has shifted and evolved, and it's maybe embracing of some different cultures, and obviously not all of them. But yeah, definitely from like that early age when I was in primary school, there were definitely times where I did feel like an outsider. But on the whole, I do look back at my childhood fondly.
As you say, you were a minority within a minority group, but then you found yourself only in touch with the majority in professional life.
Also, during childhood, it was being mixed race, but then only really being exposed to my white and English family because we lived in the UK and all my English family are here and all my Japanese family are in Japan apart from my mum. So that was also an interesting experience, noticing that difference. Also like being also surrounded by the majority, i.e. white people or English people growing up, but then not being fully English.
I really resonate with that for sure. I'm interested on your opinion on this. There is a strange question or a dynamic that you hold when you are part of an Asian community or you're mixed with another Asian group, in that you have a stronger proximity to whiteness, but there's a huge anti-Asian sentiment in the UK, massive anti-Asian sentiment, and it's so behind closed doors. It's very hidden, and I experienced anti-Asian sentiment for a really long time. And because I was in this weird position, because I was half white, I was half Asian, and it was always like I was being forced to pick a side. For example, there's a Chinese person in my year who walks past, who I'm friends with. They leave the room and one person says, "Oh, they're your cousin, right?" You know, like all these microaggressions. Yeah. And that over 7 years has an impact, doesn't it? And so I think what I'm interested in exploring, while proximity to whiteness is true, it is a fact, but we still, I think the US is kind of coming to this realization, particularly after the pandemic, but there is a very underlying sense of anti-Asian sentiment that does not get talked about in the UK at all.
Yeah, it's also after the pandemic, maybe in the US it was starting to be spoken about a bit more because of the horrific incidents that did happen. But yeah, I don't see it spoken about that much in the UK. I think it's a difficult one. When we think about diversity and inclusion, I do really feel that it feels quite competitive. Number one, from a company's perspective, in a way, it's kind of like re-traumatizing. I applied for this job sometime last year or the year before, and they were like, basically like, tell us why you're like a diverse individual and tell us why you're underrepresented and tell us like the trauma that you've experienced. It just felt very competitive, because then I'm like, okay, so is my marginalization or like the groups that I identify being like now used competitively against someone else's marginalization and like the factors that make other people diverse. So I think when we think about the different areas within diversity and inclusion, some companies have just gone about it the wrong way. Also from an individual level as well, I think it is quite competitive too, which I don't think is helpful when we think about that inclusion point at its core. Sometimes that's lost, like in things that I'm seeing recently, I feel like that's a bit lost. Thinking about discrimination towards Asian people and like the kind of Asian hate movement is absolutely overlooked.
Totally. There's room for all of us, even though we're forced into these positions where we're up against someone else and having to, for some reason, prove our diversity as the reason why you should be there. What nonsense.
I feel like it maybe comes with good intentions, but good intentions just, that's not a reason or an excuse. I'm really interested to see how the whole diversity and inclusion industry progresses, and actually calling it an industry makes it feel, I guess that kind of then takes away from the societal focus of it. And for me, I lean much more and resonate much more towards the positive societal impacts of a diverse and inclusive workforce or a diverse and inclusive society.
Well, it is becoming like an industry, isn't it?
Absolutely.
We're at a point now, especially with corporate culture, where if you don't have a head of diversity and inclusion, something's going wrong, guys.
Yeah.
A lot of people who are in these sorts of roles feel like they're banging heads against a wall. There's this constant kind of push and pull between genuinely what diverse people and companies want to talk about and and share and have people understand better, to have cultural flexibility, cultural understanding, and then senior leadership is like pushing against that. Like, oh, but we didn't want you to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. This is a big reason why I'm so hesitant to go into that industry, because while I am so committed to diversity, inclusion, and equity, I honestly don't see myself being able to have that impact by being within a team, within a corporate organization. Because as you said, like, you know, leadership comes along and they're like, no, let's focus on this.
You've spoken before, particularly on your podcast, That's My Name, about the transformative impact that language can have. In light of how you think about language after all these conversations that you've had, how do you relate to a term or a label like hafu, for example? Like, how do you relate to that?
Yeah, language is so important. And I think people really do sometimes underestimate the power that words can have, and sometimes just throw around words without really understanding the impacts. So it's really important. Yeah, thinking about terms like hafu, it's weird. Like, I heard about that term growing up, and I think my sister found a Facebook page dedicated to like hafu people. Coming back to like the label saying, I don't think I'd label, I guess technically, if we think about like what hafu means, it means half Japanese, half English, which I am. I've never used that term to describe myself, but it does come from a literal translation of Japanese language. Hafu literally means like half. And that is literally what is used to describe someone of my mix. So like my aunt in Japan would be like, oh yeah, she's hafu. But in Japanese,
that's
she's
interesting.
Yeah.
So people would use it to describe you.
Yes. Yeah.
The reason I'm asking about it is because I've read a lot of things about people who have mixed heritage with Japanese, who have a differing relationships with that phrase. Because I've heard some people who talk about the negative connotations around it, and other people who talk about how they really identify with it. And I guess coming from like a diasporic identity rooted in East London, I'm just interested in how you think about something like that.
From conversations with friends who are also half Japanese, half English, I was having a conversation with one of my good friends. She's like a sister, Olive, and she was like, yeah, like in Japan, like hafu people are really fetishized, and the way that hafu people are viewed, and I guess like objectified. So in that respect, not very comfortable. But then I think that goes way beyond just the term, and more around the societal views within Japan around people of mixed heritage or people who aren't fully Japanese.
The fetishization is a huge problem, isn't it? Not just Japan, but being a mixed white and Asian person is just not great for that. There's a lot of issues with that kind of whole space. The issue around the proximity to whiteness being perceived as attractive, but then you're receiving the issue on all different sides. From within my mum's culture, there's a fetishization around white features, and I think part of that as well is because of colonialism. When I go back and I spend time with my family and I go to the Philippines, even today still you have billboards and billboards of white models.
Yeah.
Not full Filipino models, and it's always half Filipino women who are mixed with white, who are mostly put front and center, or the models. And you can go to shops and there's whitening creams, and everybody's walking around with umbrellas to not be in the sun. And I'm told by my family, like, you should cover your skin
Yeah.
because you're getting freckles everywhere and you're dirtying your skin, blah, 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 blah. And like, it is because the brownness, the dark skin is associated with working in the fields.
Yeah.
But it's just ranting now.
Yeah. It is the same in Japan. Like, and Japanese people's skin is typically a lot fairer than Filipino people's skin. But then again, it is really much that, like, they have the skin bleaching stuff in the shops. They're the same. Let's use an umbrella. Let's wear a hat. Let's put loads of sun cream on. Let's not go outside. So, and it is from if you have darker skin, it means that you're poorer because you work in the rice fields and so on. It's really interesting how a lot of that history just kind of steeps through to views that are still in play today.
Definitely. For me, I love spending time in the outdoors. I love going on hikes and swimming and being outside in the sun. Like, when there's sun, like, I'm here, you know? Yeah, so this is about me embracing my freckles.
Yes, I love that.
What languages have you found home in?
So my relationship with my Japanese language has really evolved throughout my life. I used to be able to speak it, I think, almost fluently when I was a child, up to the age of probably 5 or 6. And that's because my mum would speak Japanese to me and my sister at home. But then it really did fade, I think, when I was in primary school, and then through to secondary school, it also faded. I think part of that is because, and I have reflected on this quite a bit, imagine, and this is in the case of my mum, coming to the UK and not really being alongside any other people who speak Japanese. So then we're surrounded by my dad, who only speaks English, and we're in an English-speaking country. So I think for my mum, it must have been so difficult to keep up our Japanese language. With the Japanese language, it probably did feel very much home for me in those really early years of my life. But then definitely in primary school, I feel there were periods, going back to the racist remarks around the Japanese side, that I did lean in way more to the English side and just shut away the Japanese side, which is really, really sad when I look back at that. And then through to secondary school, then actually for my GCSEs, I did Japanese GCSE, which I'm really, really happy that I did do. So then I think it was then revisiting that and then embracing that Japanese side more. And I feel through that I was able to find home a bit more in the Japanese language. And then much more recently, I've been taking lessons, and I went to Japan for 3 weeks earlier this year. I think being able to speak the language while I'm not fluent, it definitely helps me to feel closer with my Japanese side and you know, my Japanese family who can only speak Japanese. There's something really, really special about being able to communicate with them. And it's a big goal of mine to become fluent so I can really have those more meaningful conversations. So yeah, it's been a journey. I would say I don't think I feel necessarily home in any other languages apart from English, but that's just something that I speak and think in and dream in, day out. But yeah, Japanese, I've had a journey with it for sure.
That sounds so exciting. Excited for you on this journey.
Thank you.
Deepening that relationship. It's also really wonderful to learn and deepen a relationship with the language as an adult and have a newfound respect for it. I think because when you're young, you're learning just to communicate and just to like navigate the world. But then when it's an intention that you set for yourself, like, I'm going to learn this language to connect with my family, like your whole like approach to it is so different. Yeah, I'm hoping to do the same with Tagalog. That's the plan.
Yeah.
So yeah, we're accountability buddies.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's definitely do it. I'm definitely going to call you and be like, have you?
How's it going? Going back to the subject matter for your podcast, how can language help us unravel the true nature of things?
It's an interesting question. So many of my guests really have spoken about not just their names, but also other topics like cross-cultural communication. I had a guest on speaking about that. And then I think language is what is also interesting. This is, again, goes on a bit of a tangent, but what I find interesting about language is the fact that in some languages they don't have certain words for certain things. So I did a mental health placement in Sri Lanka, and I found out that they don't have a direct word for, I think, stress or depression or something. They don't have a direct word for it. And I found that fascinating because I think it's so important to be able to articulate or put a label on what it is you're experiencing or feeling, to then be able to process that and view and navigate that. Maybe ability or inability to have words to describe things that we're experiencing. And I learnt recently about this wheel of emotions. And, we think about emotions, it's happy, sad, and there's, a few other kind of main emotions. But actually within those, there's so many other kind of nuanced, deeper or different feelings that go beyond just happy. And you could be, oh yeah, I'm feeling happy, but actually I could be feeling ecstatic. I could be feeling overjoyed or really optimistic. And I think it's so beautiful that, within so many languages, there's the ability to kind of articulate how it is we're feeling. And I think that helps to build those meaningful connections with people.
That brought my mind to the Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows, which was partly the inspiration for naming my podcast, because Xeno, while also being part of Xenophobia and the author who came up with made up dictionary to describe obscure, nuanced feelings. And Xeno was a moment of transient connection that you feel with a stranger. So you go to a bakery and you're waiting for ages and just end up talking to the person in the queue being, oh, they're taking a long time, aren't they? It is that moment of like spark with a random person that makes you feel you're at home and makes you feel like you belong in that moment. And so that was the inspiration for that. But yeah, I think there's so much power in having words to describe nuanced feelings, right? It's emotional intelligence, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. I love that.
You've mentioned before offline about this idea of what would it be like, or what's the journey to exploring heritage in our roots. And I'm wondering, what are you thinking about in this space at the moment? How are you exploring that idea of journeying and exploring that heritage?
I've been having a few chats recently with different people around ancestry and your roots. And actually, this was a conversation I had with one of my podcast guests quite recently around, firstly, we started on the name side of things. So, your name might tie to and give you some of that identity and knowledge around where it is your family came from. So if we think about surnames, it gives that kind of indication maybe towards who your ancestors were or what happened in history. And I know with Filipino surnames, there's a real big influence from the Spanish colonization. I do have an episode on that. But going beyond the names thing, I think it's really, for me, really interesting to understand not necessarily your lineage, not, oh, this was my granddad, this was my great-granddad, but I think it's more, what were the traditions and practices that your ancestors engaged with, and what impact did this have on how they lived their life, and how do they show up in your life today? Do they, don't they? And like, do you want to embrace some of those more? Do you want to kind of practice some of those traditions or ways of being a bit more? I think that is a real way to perhaps dig a bit deeper within yourself and feel a bit more at home. I think within today's society, we feel so... there's so much of everything, as in we have social media so we can be exposed to everything in the world. But it's a very, very noisy place. And I think that sometimes it gets quite overwhelming, but then also sometimes things can feel quite lonely because, we're surrounded by people and things, but actually sometimes it can feel quite isolating in a weird way. So I think this kind of idea of tapping into your ancestors and their their practices and traditions, I think is a way to feel, okay, this is part of my identity and part of me, and this is within me. And I think this can be done in so many different ways. If you don't understand exactly what kind of traditions they're involved in, it could be food, it could be cooking, it could be games, it could be all of those different things. That someone might love sports, so it's like, what sports did your ancestors engage with? I don't know how you could find that out, but I'm sure you could. I think it's something that I'm just slowly starting to think about and reflect on recently.
I would also love to go on that journey personally. You touch on the power of rituals, how rituals can help to ground us. And rituals are practiced across generations, across time, in different cultures to celebrate, gather, understand. It's a meaning-making collective experience that we need as humans. We clearly need them because it's been done forever. And there's something sacred in that. And I think that's a lot of the modern condition that we are living in, is a lack of rituals. And Byung-Chul Han, the philosopher, talks about this in his book on rituals. And that leads to this need for belonging. How can we make belonging for ourselves in a world where it is all social media and fast-paced life, when the rituals is living on a different experience of time? I think of the quickening pace of time for us now as compared to, let's say, I don't know, Mayan culture and how they perceive time. They were very connected to natural cycles of nature. And there's something very grounding in that. The pace of it feels different. I think perhaps that's why belonging feels so existential for us, and homemaking feels so existential, because society strips you of that.
Yeah, we are really lacking as a society that. It's not identity, because I think we do have our identities, but I think that there's something within a lot of people of searching for the meaning, or searching for, maybe the identity and what makes them and what this all means. Which leads me to think about, and this is such a tangent, the wellness industry. I saw on Netflix, but there was this whole thing around how the wellness industry is just gone a bit wild. And there's just so many fads and just so much. And I think that's really trying to fill this gap of desperation of like people wanting to find the answer to solve all of their problems and issues. And they're like, oh, let's take this pill because this will make everything better. There's absolutely no one silver bullet for any of our issues. But then also I think that we live in a society where we over-prescribe and over-medicate. And we're so reluctant now to think about those natural ways of recovery and stuff like that.
The natural technology of rituals.
Yeah, exactly.
And just having tea.
Oh, I love tea. Don't get me started. Tea is life.
Yeah, there was that book, 3 Cups of Tea, I read years ago, and it was touching on, like, I think it was Afghan traditions around tea. And I think the saying was something around like 1 cup of tea, you're strangers, 2 cups of tea, you're for your friends, and then 3rd cup of tea, you're like connected for life, or something like that. Yeah, this touches on like Japanese traditions as well, like the simple act of just sharing a cup of tea with someone.
Yeah.
Probably you could save 50 quid on your wellness bill. What does home taste, sound, smell and feel like for you?
That's such a good question. So home tastes like, it tastes like pie and mash, but also my Japanese grandma's breakfasts, but not at the same time. But it can taste like both of those things.
Liquor, no liquor?
Liquor, yeah.
How many pies, how many mash?
2 pies, 1 mash. Yeah. Yeah. It smells like rain on concrete. I love that smell. Some people hate it, but I actually love that smell. It sounds like the hustle and bustle of Roman Road Market. So my grandma used to have a stall on Roman Road Market in Bow, and we'd be there every Saturday So it sounds like that. It's getting me emotional. It feels like a warm hug from my family.
I think my partner would also say his home tastes like pie and mash with 2 pies, 2 mash, liquor. I want to touch on what you said about ancestral roots. There's a fantastic podcast called All My Relations, which is hosted by 2 American women of indigenous heritage. And they talk about all things around indigenous wisdom. And they have this episode that I've queued, I'm so excited to listen to, around rematriation and the idea of tapping into your ancestral roots. And the way they describe it from their indigenous cultural perspective is the idea that rematriation is embracing the divine feminine, is embracing Mother Earth, as in contrast to the oppressive nature of patriarchal society. It is an interesting thing for me to think about, because how much of our ancestral history is hidden from us or made obscured because of a patriarchal system or because of a violent system. If it weren't as violent or oppressive, perhaps I would know more about my ancestral roots. Perhaps I would know what the rituals are. Perhaps they would be able to be passed down without it being deemed woo-woo or like something bad.
Yeah. So I think it's definitely due to patriarchal systems. I think it's also due to colonialism as well, being like, well, Western medicine and Western views are the right views, and we're just going to oppose that on the rest of the world. So, the view that Western views are right and the best, and that we're just going to enforce that on everyone else. I think that's absolutely why we don't know that much about the ancestral traditions. And I think that that's maybe also people shunning them as well. Like, like how I did when I was literally just 7, being like, I'm just going to focus on my white side. Which is, I think that's a real reflection of like society. I think the patriarchy and patriarchal systems are responsible for a lot of bad things in this world. But I feel like that's a whole other, I could go off on such a tangent. Even things like, marriage, my views towards marriage have shifted so much throughout my life. So from growing up in a patriarchal society of, I'm going to get married and I'm going to have this amazing wedding. Yeah, I'm going to take my husband's surname and all the way up to like now, I'm like, if I get married, I'll absolutely not be taking my husband's surname. I really don't think I want to get married. Like, as a joke the other day to my boyfriend, I was like, oh, like, are we going to get married? And he was like, you don't even want to get married. Like, you literally, because I'm always like, I don't want to get married. It's just like passing ownership between the dad and then the husband. And it is like, that's what it was steeped in, right? And, no shade on people who want to get married. Like, it can be a beautiful thing. But then for me, I'm like, I look deeper and I'm like, don't want to do that.
It's like, it's going to be Maya Mitsuko September Welford. That's it, guys. Sorry.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I can
patrilineal names here.
Yeah, exactly.
Where can people find you and follow you to keep up to date with your work?
Yeah, for sure. LinkedIn, Maya Welford, or Instagram at that'smyname_pod.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed it. So thank you.
You've been listening to Zeno. To stay up to date with our monthly episodes, you can sign up to our newsletter at zenocast.org or follow us on Instagram at @Zeno_pod. Our theme music is composed by Alex Julian Edwards.